I think let's continue this because it's a very interesting topic that you started to talk about. The main question that appears to me after this round, who can win this trade war? What happens with this trade war? Is it going on or it will be balanced out? What are your bets and why? John.
Yeah, if I can just say a word picking up on what you said. I think the way to think about the world we're moving into is to separate the economic from the security competition and think about it in the context of the pre-World War I period, not the Cold War. Now you're probably saying to yourself, what is he talking about? Before World War I, here in Europe, there was a huge amount of economic intercourse among all of the states. There was a huge amount of economic interdependence here in Europe. Nevertheless, at the same time, you had two powerful security blocs. One was the Triple Entente, which was France, Britain, and Russia, and the other was the Triple Alliance. Germany, of course, was the key player, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And you had this intense security competition before World War I that, of course, in August 1914, led to World War I. But at the same time you had this intense security competition, you had all this economic interdependence. Fast forward to the Cold War, when I grew up, there was hardly any economic intercourse between the West and the East. So there was security competition, but no economic intercourse. The situation moving forward is going to look like the pre-World War I period. It's not going to look like the Cold War. There's going to be a great deal of economic intercourse between India and China, the United States and China, Europe and China. The key issue inside the economic realm will have to do with high-edge or cutting-edge technologies. That's what the United States really cares about in terms of the competition with China. And just to take Europe and how this competition will affect Europe, there's no question, given the economic state of Europe, that European states will have a powerful incentive to want to trade with China. And the United States will tolerate that as long as Europeans don't trade cutting-edge technologies to the Chinese. Because what the Americans are trying to do, as Eric knows very well, is the Americans are trying to throttle, slow down China's development of cutting-edge technologies. And the United States is not going to be happy if Europe trades cutting-edge technologies or technologies that feed into cutting-edge technologies with China. But nevertheless, Europeans, Americans, Indians, we're going to trade with the Chinese. But at the same time, you're going to have a wicked and very dangerous security competition in East Asia for many, many years moving forward.
Eric?
I think if the United States wants to contain China through technological means, which is understandable, then I think they're pursuing very mistaken tactics. I mean, I don't understand why. I mean, by cutting off semiconductor, for instance, when Mr. Biden did, and the Chinese were asleep at the wheel for a long time on the stuff. They woke up the Chinese and said, whoa, this is what they could do to us. And listen, we graduate more STEM students than the rest of the world combined. Okay, and we got research dollars more than the rest of the world combined. If you don't think we can lick semiconductor, you gotta be out to lunch. I mean, so I just don't think that's the productive way to go about it. By the way, I totally understand. I think the Chinese understand the U.S. wants to reindustrialize. If I were running the United States, I would want to reindustrialize too. I just wish there could be a friendlier way to go about it externally. And I actually think, that's why I'm actually reasonably optimistic. I actually think the Chinese would be willing to cooperate and maybe contribute to that effort. Certainly, China is the largest industrial power in the world. There's some kind of accommodation that could be reached, I believe, if we pursue a friendlier atmosphere.
How should we decode this? Is it a positive or a negative answer to my question of the trade war? How should we decode it? Is it a positive or a negative answer that the trade war can end soon? Or how do you see this, Liz?
I very much agree with this. We're going to end up with two competing networks, and in fact I think that's what's already been happening. We haven't talked about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and Africa, but what has happened is the United States for the last 25 years haven't really been playing on that economic pitch. They haven't been signing new trade deals. They've been allowing China to use the Belt and Road Initiative, use trade to pull more countries into their orbit. And we're seeing what we're seeing with the trade war, which is also offers of trade deals as well. So, people lining up at the White House to sign new deals with the president, is the US re-engaging in that economic battle that it pretty much left the pitch on, particularly during the Biden presidency. Ultimately, and this is where I slightly disagree with the term multipolar, the US is still the most powerful country in the world. And ultimately, I don't think it has been using its leverage for the last 25 years. And that is what President Trump is fundamentally doing. He's saying, I'm going to use the leverage of the US consumer market to get what I want with respect to Europe. So Europe has all kinds of non-trade barriers up against US products. Those can be removed under economic pressure. America can also put pressure on Europe as to what we do with China, and what our economic relationship is with China, and which goods we can or which services can be traded with China. So there is a big opportunity for the US to use its leverage at present. I think within a decade or so, China would have gained sufficiently that would no longer be possible, which is why I think now is exactly the right time to act. And of course, China isn't going to like that.
I think that we have a lot of time to unpack it over the next couple of days, but I'm trying not to use a Latin expression from my old study of scholastic philosophy, but the word multipolar is said in many ways, and I think when U.S. decision makers refer to it, they mean something like what Liz is saying, and when it's used at the BRICS Council, it means something different. So there are those who use the word multipolar to say, well, thank God that we've moved away from the era of Western hegemony, and it'll be much better for world peace, et cetera, if there's a different set of world powers. And I think when Secretary Rubio, again, just trying to interpret when U.S. decision makers have referred to this recently, I think that they're speaking more in the manner that Liz is suggesting, that the situation of the world now resulted in part from catastrophic decisions by Western leaders, and using the window of opportunity that is available to them and the options that are available, policy levers and options that are available to them, they will try to situate America and the West to compete better, or to realize, as you say, what the different levers of influence are and what the different planes of competition are. So everyone made fun of Trump when he declared that it's now the Gulf of America, and started talking about the Panama Canal and Canada and Greenland. But if objectively things are in a more multipolar situation, for better or worse, one of the things that you naturally can focus on is your region. You have a better knowledge there. There's even a historical doctrine in the U.S. context, the Monroe Doctrine, which has oriented American policy toward attending to the nature of its own region, and probably you're going to be better at figuring out how to navigate that than doing something very far-flung. And Trump, by picking this term Gulf of America, again, people thought it was ridiculous, but it's precisely that kind of meme generation capacity that he has that puts a word out there and then suddenly everyone's talking about it and actually it ends up as memes do. Glad we've gotten to the serious part of the discussion, but as memes do, ends up shaping the way that people think. The problem, or a big problem within the US from this standpoint, though, is that there's a huge amount of path dependency around being a primarily consumer-oriented economy, and there's even and the status of the US dollar as a global reserve currency has been the hinge on which that rests. So I think that there is some truth also to what Eric says, that the policy levers that the West was able to use in the 1990s, successfully defending itself by imposing sanctions on particular industries or on particular types of exports, was effective in many ways, but the results of those actions are less effective today. One of the things that has been weaponized in the last few years through the sanctions imposed on Russia and the SWIFT system was the reserve currency status itself. And it will be a quite complex political problem, although a very important one. I mean, it is in a way the problem that the US needs to solve in order to compete well in upcoming years. But the problem that it will have to solve is how to maneuver itself, hold together as a country, and shift toward a more industrial economy. That means it's less based on freewheeling acquisition of debts or debt-driven consumer society, moving away from that and managing the political results of that and increasing investment. That's a quite complicated process, and somehow putting a few markers down like Gulf of America or looking in the region is something that I think will help that along.
Sanjeev and then John, and then we move to the next topic.
So I think one issue is that the personal style of President Trump very often distracts from the wider issue that there needed to be some radical change that had to happen in the US's approach to the world. And take, for example, the shutting down of US aid. When it was done, there were sort of those of a liberal bent were of the opinion that recipient countries would be very unhappy about this. But in fact, most recipient countries, like India, were rather pleased about the fact that the US aid was shut down, because it was mostly used for interfering and doing regime change and those kinds of things in these recipient countries. So, those tools had run their course. Maybe they used to be useful at one point in time. I don't think so, but anyway, maybe they did. But that cycle had ended. Similarly, these international institutions like WHO and so on clearly didn't function during the one point in history it needed to have, which was the COVID crisis. So I think there was a case for radical reorientation. Whether or not the way President Trump is going about it, we can debate. But I can see that this turbulence that we are seeing in terms of the world order, the old world order dissolving, is something I think was inevitable. And it was inevitable consequently that the old power, so to speak, was going to change its approach in many ways. But one has to also take into account that it's a game in which other players will also play their moves. And so yes, if you deny China certain technologies, it's not unreasonable that it too will develop some of those technologies. Now, as an emerging third pole, and we have some way to go, we have to navigate between all of these things. So I think the most important thing for a country like India and others as well, like Europe and so on, will be the extent to which we can pursue longer-term objectives while retaining as much flexibility and optionality as possible.
John?
I'll just say, 1 minute worth of comments, and then you can go to the next issue. I just want to make it clear that I was not arguing that the United States will defeat the Chinese in this economic race or in this arms race. The Chinese are incredibly impressive, and there are all sorts of reasons to think that the United States is in deep trouble and not up for arms racing, either economically or militarily, with the Chinese.